Fellas, the UFC returns to Canada this week for a fight night. Moreno versus Albazi, Blankfield versus Namajunas. We've got Derek Lewis on the card. It's actually a pretty good card for a fight night as well. It's in front of a crowd too. So we're going to be breaking down every fighter that's going to be competing on UFC Edmonton, as well as my own personal prediction at the end. Now, in terms of last week's predictions, I ended up going 8-5 on the card, which is a pretty bad prediction. 4-1 on the main card ain't too bad, but 8-5 as a whole, pretty bad. So we need to redeem ourselves, and we will start off with the first fight on this card, which is going to be Anheliger versus Cody Gibson. Quite a low-level fight to start off the card, to be fair. Anheliger, he had a good run outside the UFC, was a champion in a different organisation, actually was able to beat Brady Highstand by finish, and Brady Highstand is now in the UFC as well, so that was a good win. Since then, he won on the Contender Series and then ended up going 2-2 in the UFC, so he hasn't had the best start to his career. He's going to be taking on Cody Gibson, who actually fought in the UFC way back in 2014, went 1-3, but he had his UFC debut to Aiemann Sterling, pretty tough debut, and since then, went on a decent run outside the UFC, actually managed to pick up a win over John Dodson, and if anyone knows John Dodson, you'll know that dude's an absolute animal, so he had a good win there. Came back to the UFC via the Ultimate Fighter, where he's on Michael Chandler's team, did pretty good in the Ultimate Fighter, and since then he's gone 2-1 in the UFC, 1-2 in the UFC, with his loss to Brad Katona on the Ultimate Fighter, lost to Miles Johnson, and his most recent fight finished Brian Kelleher. In terms of who I'm picking to win, I'm probably going to go with Cody Gibson to win this one by decision. I think Gibson's pretty tough. I think he showed in that fight with Brad Katona he can take a shot. He's a pretty durable, a pretty tough guy. And he's also well-rounded as well. He's got good grappling. He's got good striking. He's pretty good everywhere the fight goes. The thing about Cody Gibson is he's not elite everywhere, okay? Your second you put him against like an elite fighter, he's losing. So he's not elite, but he's pretty good everywhere. He's got good grappling. His jiu-jitsu ain't too bad. His striking's pretty good as well. And he's able to keep that up for about 2 rounds, because he tends to fade in that third round, which is why I think Anheliger's got the best opportunity in that third round. When Cody Gibson starts to fade, he's got a good pressure boxing style, does Anheliger. But I'm going to have to go with Cody Gibson to win. I think he's faced a better opposition so far. I think I've seen a lot more from Cody Gibson than I have from Anheliger, and I think he's come back from opposition a lot better, and he's just more tough than Anheliger. So I'm going to go with Cody Gibson to win this one by decision, but like I said at the beginning, a pretty low-level fight. And then we have Sidey versus Armfield. Garrot Armfield taking on Sidey. Now for Sidey, he was on a decent run outside the UFC as well, a champion in a different organisation. Came from the Contender Series where he was able to beat Raymond Tavares. And then he had to face Raymond Tavares again immediately for his UFC debut, in which he lost by decision. He's going to be taking on Garrot Armfield, who was on a pretty good run outside the UFC as well. Lost to David Onama in the UFC by finish, and it was kind of tough because he also had to fight David Onama in the regional scene as well. So it wasn't the first time he had to face him either. And since then, he's got 2-1 in the UFC with his most recent fight. He got finished by Brady Highstand, who we talked about a second ago. I'm actually going to go with Garrot Armfield to finish Sidey in this fight. I think this is quite a big underdog pick. I've seen a lot of people picking Sidey to win this fight, but I'm going to go with Garrot Armfield to win this one by TKO in the second round. Sidey, he's durable, right? He's able to go rounds. He's able to make it a scrap, but I feel like his chin doesn't really suit his style, because he's quite a chinny guy. You hit him with a big shot, he tends to be wobbled. He got dropped again in that fight with Raymond Tavares, and you put him against a really good boxer in what's his name? Garrot Armfield. Garrot Armfield's a pretty solid boxer. I don't really like the odds. I think Garrot Armfield's going to clip Sidey at some point in this fight. The longer the fight goes, the longer I'm probably going to face Sidey, because like I said, he has got the stamina, he has got the durability, but I think he's way too hittable. He's not got the best chin, and you put him up against a really good boxer in Garrot Armfield. I'm going to go with Garrot Armfield to win this one by TKO, by stoppage in the second round. And then we have a fight between the big boys, Romanov versus Nascimento, a fight between two ranked heavyweights in the heavyweight division, obviously number 13th ranked Romanov and 15th ranked Nascimento. Now, for Alexandr Romanov, he was actually quite a big prospect in the UFC, out in the heavyweight division, let me make it clear. Because he was basically just dominating everyone he's put against, basically just ragdolling people, picking them up and doing whatever he wants with them. And that was kind of the story from the beginning of his UFC career as well, because he was dominating everyone with his grappling. His control time was just racking up. He was bullying people with ground and pound. He was basically just mauling people, not the same mauling as you'd expect from like a guy like Khabib or another high-level wrestler, mainly just laying on people and occasionally hitting them in the face so he doesn't get stood back up. But he actually managed to go on a 5-fight win streak for the beginning of his UFC career, but he's kind of fallen off recently. Against ranked opponents, he's 1-3. So I think he's shown that he's not good enough for the top level, but he's still good enough to stay in the rankings so far. He's going to be taking on Rodrigo Nascimento, who got a finish on the Contender Series, got a finish in his UFC debut against Don'Tale Mayers. Then he got finished by Kyle Dorcas, the brother of Chris Dorcas. Then he had a decent run, went 3 wins with a no contest to Alan Bador, until his last fight where he had a fight night main event opportunity against Derek Lewis, and he got knocked out, put to sleep in that fight. In terms of who I'm picking to win, it's going to be a grapple fest regardless, but I'm leaning towards Alexandr Romanov getting this done by decision. I think he's a better wrestler. He's shown that at the beginning of his UFC career, he is a pretty good wrestler as well as Alexandr Romanov. When he takes people down, it's very rare that people get back up. He was able to dominate Marcin Tavares for that first round as well. The only problem with Alexandr Romanov is the gas tank. He genuinely gets gassed after like 1 minute of fighting. I think you put this dude in a 5-round fight, we were maybe witnessing a murder live, because this dude's gas tank is terrible. So that's the only problem with Romanov, but he's going to be taking on Nascimento, who's probably got the better jiu-jitsu and they've got the better submission game than Romanov. Maybe not so much the wrestling as he showed in that fight with Ilia Latifi when he got taken down pretty comfortably. But yeah, I think Alexandr Romanov is going to take Nascimento down, control him for the first couple of rounds, at least hold him against the cage, and then maybe in that last round when Romanov's literally got nothing left, maybe that's when Nascimento has the best opportunity to maybe go for a finish or at least rack up some points and win the round. But to be honest, I don't see either of them finishing each other. I don't think Nascimento is going to be able to submit Romanov, and I don't think Romanov really has the best submission ability, so I'm going to go with Romanov. On top of that as well, Romanov has faced the better opponents. I know he's lost, but he's faced Tabura where he won a round, he faced Volkov, he's faced Almeida. The best fighter that Nascimento's fought is Lewis, and he got knocked out, so I'm going to go with Romanov to win this one by decision. And then we have Jack Shaw versus Yusuff Zalal. This is a pretty tough one to pick, because you've got Yusuff Zalal, who was in the UFC back in 2020, went 3-3 in the UFC, ended up going on a 3-fight losing streak, and he actually went to a decision with Ilia Topuria, which has kind of aged well because of the the streak that Topuria's on nowadays. Went on a 3-fight winning streak outside the UFC, came back, got 2 straight finishes. He's going to be taking on Jack Shaw, who's a former Cage Warriors champion, went on a big winning streak for the beginning of his UFC career, 5-fight winning streak, and was actually 14th ranked in the bantamweight division and was on the tied 3rd longest win streak. So he had quite a bit going for him until he ran into Ricky Simon, got submitted and finished by Ricky Simon. Then he got the finish over Amir until his last fight, where his leg got absolutely slashed at UFC 301 against Joanderson Brito. I wouldn't recommend you go and watch that fight. It was pretty brutal. It's a tough one to call. It wouldn't surprise me if Jack Shaw's able to get this one done. But I'm going to go with Yusuff Zalal to win this one by decision. Like I said, Jack Shaw, he's got good offensive striking. He's not bad on the feet. And when it comes to grappling, that's his bread and butter. He likes taking people down and getting the control time, finding the jiu-jitsu. I think he does a really good job at mixing the striking up with his grappling. But I feel like Zalal is a really bad matchup. He's on a 5-fight winning streak. He's had 2 good submissions in the UFC. And I think when it comes to a pure jiu-jitsu game, I'm going to favour Yusuff Zalal. I think if Jack Shaw's game plan is to take him down, it's dangerous territory for Jack Shaw. And on top of that, I just think that Yusuff Zalal is a more dynamic striker as well for Jack Shaw. Jack Shaw is more of a... He uses his striking mainly to set up his takedowns, where I feel like Zalal can actually stay on the feet and strike. So I'm going to go with Yusuff Zalal to win this one by decision. But it is a tough one to pick. It's not an easy or a confident pick, should I say. And then we've got Charles Jourdain versus Victor Henry. Now, Charles Jourdain, a bit of a failed prospect. Had a good run outside the UFC. Was able to finish every single fighter that he was able to beat. Had a bit of a bad start to his UFC career. Went 2-3 in the UFC with a draw to Josh Kulibau. And since then, he's been super streaky. 2 wins, 2 losses, 2 wins, 2 losses with his most recent fight, him getting finished at UFC 303. Against Gene Silva. He's going to be taking on Victor Henry, who has been a champion in like multiple different promotions before the UFC. Actually was able to beat Kyler Phillips before the UFC as well, which obviously we know Kyler Phillips for being ranked nowadays. And in the UFC, he's 3-1 with a no contest to Javid Bashrat, but he got his most recent win over Yaya, where he was able to get the finish. It should be a good fight. I am going to go with Charles Jourdain to win this one by decision. Now, it really just depends on how Charles Jourdain looks at bantamweight, because he is moving down to the bantamweight division despite being at featherweight before. So it's going to be interesting to see how he does at this new division. But I'm going to go with Charles Jourdain. I'm a really big fan of Jourdain's kickboxing. He's got like this kind of... How do I say it? Like this scrappy kickboxing style, kind of this unorthodox, not the most technical, but it's a very wild, scrappy style of kickboxing that seems to work. He's going to be taking on Victor Henry, who's also got good kickboxing, but his defense is very questionable. He kind of just bobs his head around, and he's quite slow as well on the feet. I feel like Charles Jourdain... The problem with Charles Jourdain is, I remember people were labeling him as this like big Canadian prospect. He had quite a bit of potential, but it seems like the second he gets momentum, he just loses it in a bad way. But he's been losing it to decent opponents. He lost it to Nathaniel Wood and Gene Silver and Sean Woodson. Victor Henry ain't on the same level as those guys. I think Charles Jourdain's going to be able to pull through and get at least a decision in the bantamweight division against Victor Henry. But again, it kind of just depends on how he looks in this division. Then we've got Ariana Lipski versus Jasmine, and I always fuck up the long last names. Jasmine Jasudavicious. There we go. I always mess up with the long last names. What's that Russian dude as well? I think he's called like Magomed Gaziazulov as well. I don't know why people have to have such long last names in the UFC. But anyway, for Lipski, I think she's changed her name as well. It has to Lipski. But anyway, Lipski, she was a champion outside the UFC. Lost her first 2 fights in the UFC to Molly McCann and Joanne Wood. Then she went 2-2 in the next 4. Then she went in a bit of a decent streak. She went 4-1 in the next 5 until her most recent fight where she lost to Corrine Silva. She's going to be taking on Jasmine. Outside the UFC, didn't have the longest career. She lost to Elise Reed, which isn't a bad loss because now Elise Reed is succeeding in the UFC. Won in the Contender Series, and since then she's looked pretty good in the UFC. Her only losses to Natalia Silva and ranked Tracy Cortez. She's on a 2-fight winning streak as well. In terms of who I'm going to pick to win this one, I'm going to go with Jasmine to win this one by decision. I think Lipski's got good jiu-jitsu, but I'm not a massive fan of her wrestling. I'm not a massive fan of her takedown defense, or I think jiu-jitsu's kind of all she's really got going for her apart from a decent kickboxing base. Jasmine seems to be a much better grappler. She's kind of got this relentless grappling pace. She's able to keep up for 3 rounds straight. She's got really good grappling, really good submission ability, and I think she's kind of going to overwhelm Lipski with the grappling. I don't think she's going to get a submission because, like I said, Lipski has got pretty good jiu-jitsu, but I think wrestling alone, Jasmine Jasudavicious has got a pretty good wrestling prospect in her division. Good grappler, well, great grappling to be fair. So I think she's going to out-wrestle Lipski and get the win by decision. Zahabi versus Munhoz. Now, Zahabi, he was on a big winning streak outside the UFC, finishing everyone. Comes to the UFC, loses his first 2 fights in the UFC back in 2017 and 2019, but since then, he's kind of turned his career around. 4-fight winning streak, took the auto away from Javid Bashrat, got a win over Ricky Tercios, had some good wins on this 4-fight winning streak. He's going to be taking on Pedro Munhoz, who is a UFC veteran, been in the UFC since 2014. And has kind of lost at every single top fighter that he's put against. Nearly every single top fighter that Pedro Munhoz has fought, he's ended up losing to. But he's also had some good wins. He finished Cody Garbrandt. He finished Rob Font. He had a win over Chris Gutierrez recently as well. And he's never been finished in his MMA career, so he's really tough as well, is Pedro Munhoz. In terms of who I'm going to pick to win this fight, I know that Zahabi is quite a big favourite, I think, anyway, going into this fight. And he has looked good. He looks like he's massively improved. But I'm going to go with Pedro Munhoz to win this fight. Zahabi's a good kickboxer. He's a very dangerous, powerful kickboxer. But I feel like this is quite a bad matchup. I mean, he's a very powerful guy, Zahabi, but I feel like that power can be countered by the fact that, like I said before, Munhoz is tough. Never been finished in his MMA career. He's taken so many big shots and he's been able to survive. He's got a chin and a half on him. And I also think he's got this really good high output style that seems to work as Pedro Munhoz, even against some of the top guys as well. And I feel like Zahabi, as dangerous as he is, he's not the highest output. Like, he throws like one combination every 30 seconds. Pedro Munhoz, he's a very high output fighter. It's almost as if the dude's always throwing something. And I feel like on the points, that's going to be beneficial to Pedro Munhoz, and I think the power is going to be countered by how tough Munhoz is, and the fact that Munhoz only seems to be going against the top guys. You know, Kyler Phillips, Marlon Vera, Sean O'Malley, Dominic Cruz. Zahabi's never faced anyone on the level of Pedro Munhoz, so I'm going to go with Munhoz to win this one by decision. I think this is a bit of a step up for Zahabi. Then we've got Mike Mallot recovering from that fraud check. He's going to be taking on Trevin Giles. Now, these guys actually competed in the grappling contest on Fury Grappling. Mike Mallot was able to get the win. In terms of MMA, every single one of his fights has ended by finish, which, you know, is kind of a fun guy to see whether he's winning or whether he's losing. Won in the Contender Series, ended up beating Mickey Gall in his next fight, and then he ended up getting 2 straight finishes until his last fight where he had a ranked opportunity against Neil Magny. Was en route to winning that fight and then kind of just gave up in the last minute by just kind of laying there, letting Neil Magny bully him with ground and pound. He's going to be taking on Trevin Giles, who was on a really good run outside the UFC, actually had some wins, had a finish over Brendan Allen, and had a good win over Ryan Spann. So he's got some wins over the current UFC roster, and so far in the UFC, well, not so far in the UFC, but the beginning of his UFC career was looking promising as well. Went 5-2, had a good win over Roman Dolidze as well, but then he gets fed to Dricus du Plessis and Michael Morales as well. Ends up losing those fights. Goes on a 2-fight winning streak just to get fed to Carlos Prates and Bomb Firm as well. So it seems like the UFC, every single time they've got some killer up and coming, they just feed Trevin Giles to them. And now he's going to be taking on Mike Mallot. I'm going to go with Mike Mallot to win this one. I think he's going to submit him in the second round. I'm hoping that Mike Mallot has learned from his mistakes that he did at UFC 297. I'm basing this purely off the fact that Mike Mallot was pretty much dominating Trevin Giles in that grappling match that they had. And now that you're able to mix in the good striking of Mike Mallot as well, I think this is only going to be more beneficial for him. So I'm going to go with Mike Mallot to win this one by sub in the second round. I think he's going to take him down, get the submission within a couple of rounds. Fairly well-rounded is Mike Mallot. I'm hoping he's learned from his mistakes. And Trevin Giles, I mean, he's on a 2-fight losing streak. You kind of question how good he's going to be when he's going against Mike Mallot, who I still think has ranked potential as well. Just because he suffered a loss to Neil Magny, he was dominating most of the fight. So I'm going to go with fraud-checked Mike Mallot to win this one by sub. Then we've got Caio Machado versus Brendson Ribeiro. 2 guys that are yet to win in the UFC. Now, Caio Machado was a champion in a different promotion. Good streak outside the UFC. Wins on the Contender Series by absolute domination until he loses to Mick Parkin and Dontel Mayers. And now he's going to be moving down to the light heavyweight division against Brendson Ribeiro, who's a very dangerous guy. Every single one of his wins come by way of finish. Got a good finish on the Contender Series, but since then he got beaten by Zhang. And this is the long last name I'm on about, Gaji Azulov. In terms of who I think wins this fight, it really just depends on how Machado looks at light heavyweight, but Machado, in my opinion, is more well-rounded. I think he's a really well-rounded guy. He's got good striking. He's got good grappling. He's pretty solid everywhere. He's got a chin on him as well. He's taken some big shots that he's able to survive as well, especially by Don'Tale Mayes as well. So he's got quite a good chin. In terms of Ribeiro, I think he's more dangerous. I think he's got more chance of finishing the fight. And I am going to pick him to win this one by KO in the first round because of that reason. I think Machado, again, how is he going to look in the light heavyweight division? Does he still have power? Is he still going to be able to use that weight advantage? Is he going against Ribeiro, who he lost to Jasudavicious, where he's basically being fed to Jasudavicious there. But he's a very dangerous guy. Defensively might not be the soundest, but Machado's not necessarily the most powerful either. So I'm going to go with Ribeiro by KO in the first round. I think he's going to land some big shots on Machado and get the finish inevitably. But again, it's kind of hard to pick. It depends on how Machado does look at light heavyweight. Then we've got Marc-Andre Barriault versus Dustin Stoltzfus. Now, Marc-Andre Barriault, before the UFC, had a really good run, came up to the UFC, lost his first 3 fights in the UFC, and then, you know, he's still lucky to be in the UFC at this point. And then he finally gets a win, just for it to be overturned due to steroids, or at least that's what the Nevada State Athletic Commission thought about it. So he ended up getting overturned. Then since then, he's kind of cleaned his career up a bit. He's had a good run outside the UFC, well, inside the UFC since then, with his only losses being to Chidi and Anthony Hernandez. And then he goes on a 2-fight winning streak after Anthony Hernandez, just to run into Chris Curtis, which he had quite a close competitive fight with. And then he gets put to sleep brutally at UFC 303 against Joe Piper. He's going to be taking on Dustin Stoltzfus. Dustin Stoltzfus is quite a low-level fighter. He was able to beat Joe Piper from the Contender Series, but it was due to an injury. It wasn't like a legitimate win. And then since then, he's kind of just been going back and forth with wins and losses, kind of losing most of his fights. Hasn't really been able to pick up the most momentum, losing to the likes of Abbas Magomedov, until his last fight where he got brutally finished by Bruno Ferreira by the spinning elbow. I'm going to go with Marc-Andre Barriault by TKO in the third round. I think Dustin Stoltzfus, like I said before, is bottom of the barrel talent in the UFC. The dude is 2-5 in his UFC career so far. If he loses this one, he's getting cut. I think he's probably the worst active middleweight right now in the UFC. And I think he's a very favourable matchup for Marc-Andre Barriault. He had a very close and competitive fight with Chris Curtis, who used to be ranked. He's got a good kickboxing base, good pressure boxing, kickboxing, and he's able to keep it up for multiple rounds as well. Dustin Stoltzfus, he's a powerful guy. He's got good jiu-jitsu, but I feel like Marc-Andre Barriault, he's got good takedown defense. He's going to keep it on the feet, and I think he's going to walk forward and cruise against Stoltzfus. I think he's going to be quite cautious early on because he has just been KO'd in the first round by Joe Piper, and Dustin Stoltzfus is dangerous. But I think later on in the fight, that's where we're going to see Marc-Andre Barriault tee off on Dustin Stoltzfus and once again get the finish by TKO in the third round. Then we've got Derek Lewis versus Denise. Now, this was supposed to be Derek Lewis versus Alexandr Romanov, and they've switched it to this, which I actually kind of like. I think these matches are much better. Denise, fairly unknown to the UFC, but he's a bit of a finisher. 7 of his 8 MMA wins coming by way of knockout. Actually came from Glory Kickboxing and has faced some of the best kickboxers on the planet as well. So he comes from a big kickboxing background in Glory Kickboxing. Won on the Contender Series, then ends up knocking out Austin Lane, and then he ends up winning his last fight against Carl Williams. He's getting a massive step up against Derek Lewis. I don't need to introduce you to Derek Lewis. Most knockouts in UFC heavyweight history. He went on a 3-fight losing streak recently, but he's able to pick it up with a win over Marcos Rogero de Lima. A short notice loss to Jelton Almeida in his last fight, like I said, knocked out Rodrigo Nascimento. I'm going to have to go with Derek Lewis to win this one by knockout in the second round. I know that Denise comes from Glory Kickboxing as a prospect, but this is a massive step up in competition against the most devastating puncher right now in the UFC, Derek Lewis, who has faced multiple different styles, and Denise was losing that last round to Carl Williams. If you're going to a decision with Carl Williams, and after that you're getting a big fight with the most powerful puncher in the UFC in Derek Lewis, I'm not favouring your odds. I'm going with Derek Lewis to win this one by knockout in the second round. I think the UFC have done a good job at matchmaking this fight because it's pretty much regardless of who wins, it's going to win in the finish, but I do think that Derek Lewis is going to be the one to serve that finish. I'm going Derek Lewis by knockout in the second. Then we've got Rose Namajunas versus Erin Blankfield. A potential number 1 contender fight for who fights for the belt next. Rose Namajunas, obviously, 2-time former champion in the UFC. And I feel like ever since she had that fight, that knockout win over Zhang Weili, she's kind of fell off because her rematch with Zhang Weili was a lot more closer. Then she lost the belt in one of the most boring fights in UFC history to Carla Esparza, and then she got beaten by Fiorot, but she has been able to pick it up in the last 2 with a decision win over Amanda Ribas and Tracy Cortez. She's going to be taking on Erin Blackfield, who was once on an absolute tear in the UFC and was looking like she was going to be the next champion until she faced Fiorot in a number 1 contender fight and looked terrible in that fight and got beaten by Fiorot. Like I said before, this could be a potential number 1 contender fight. The winner gets another shot at Fiorot or Shevchenko, whoever wins that fight. But I'm going to go with Rose Namajunas to win this one by decision. Now, I know that Erin Blankfield has really good jiu-jitsu grappling. She is quite a good grappler as well. But Rose Namajunas also has good wrestling. She showed that in the fight with Zhang Weili. Rose Namajunas has really underrated wrestling, in my opinion. But what separates the two of them is the striking. Erin Blankfield's striking looked completely laughable in that fight with Fiorot. Like, her striking was embarrassingly bad. And Rose Namajunas has pretty technical striking. If you're not an elite striker in the women's division, in the women's strawweight division, she will pick you apart and she will get the win. So I'm going to go with Rose Namajunas, not the women's strawweight division, the bantamweight division. So I'm going to go with Rose Namajunas to win this one by decision. I think she's just better, maybe not better everywhere, but I think she's going to do enough to keep it on the feet and absolutely piece up Erin Blankfield on the feet. Blankfield did not look good against Fiorot. Namajunas, she's on a 2-fight winning streak. She's a former champion. She's fought better opponents. I'm going to go with Rose Namajunas to win this one, and I'm going to say she gets it done by decision. Then we've got the main event, Brandon Moreno versus Amir Albazi. This is a reschedule. It was supposed to happen at UFC Mexico early this year, but Brandon Moreno fought Royval instead, lost that fight. Amir Albazi, he's had a pretty good run in his MMA career. Had a really good run outside the UFC, and in the UFC, he was he's basically just beating everyone in the UFC. Good jiu-jitsu grappler until he had that fight night main event against Caio Kara-France last year, in which he had a very close decision with. Most people thought Caio Kara-France won, including myself, and he had a bit of a robbery win over Caio Kara-France. He's going to be taking on Brandon Moreno, who started his UFC career off by losing on the Ultimate Fighter to Pantoja, goes on a 3-fight winning streak, loses again to Pantoja and Sergio Pettis, goes on quite a run, wins the belt, becomes a champion. So he's a former flyweight champion. Then he loses to Figueiredo, beats Figueiredo again for the belt, and he's fought Figueiredo 4 different times now. But he has also lost to Pantoja and Royval in his last 2. He's going to be taking on Amir Albazi. I'm going to go with Brandon Moreno to win this one. I think Moreno wins this one by decision. It's not a super confident pick, but Moreno, I mean, the dude, he finished Caio Kara-France. He's got a win over Brandon Royval. He submitted Davison Figueiredo. Albazi's best win is a robbery win over Caio Kara-France. As much as Albazi's a good grappler, and I think he will be in the top 5 for a while, I've got to go with Brandon Moreno to win this one. Former champion, better opponents, better boxer as well. Stylistically better matchup for him. So I'm going to go with Brandon Moreno to win this one by decision. But let me know your thoughts on this week's fight night and your own personal picks for UFC Edmonton. And yeah, thank you for watching.